At the age of 20, when most kings were still learning how to rule, Alexander of Macedon inherited a kingdom surrounded by enemies and drowning in doubt. His father, Philip II, had been assassinated suddenly, leaving behind a powerful army but a fragile political situation. Greek city-states whispered rebellion. Rival kings prepared to strike. To many, Alexander looked like a temporary ruler, a boy king who would soon be erased by history. But what the world failed to understand was that this young man carried an ambition so vast that it could not be contained by borders, armies, or fear. Within just 13 years, Alexander would lead his soldiers farther than any army had ever marched before. From the mountains of Greece to the deserts of Egypt, from the heart of Persia to the rivers of India, cities would fall and empires would collapse in his wake. He would defeat the largest military force on earth, humble kings who ruled for centuries, and carve out the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen. This was not luck. This was not chance. This was the result of vision, strategy, and a belief that he was destined to rule the world. The question is not what Alexander conquered, the real question is how one man managed to conquer the known world and change history forever. Before Alexander became a legend, Macedonia was seen as an outsider by the Greek world. While cities like Athens and Sparta prided themselves on philosophy, democracy, and culture, Macedonia was viewed as rough, militaristic, and uncivilized. Yet beneath this reputation, King Philip II was quietly building the most powerful army Greece had ever seen. He reformed military training, introduced the long sarissa spear, and turned peasant soldiers into disciplined professionals. The Macedonian phalanx became a moving wall of iron, nearly impossible to break. Philip didn't just build an army, he reshaped power itself. Through diplomacy, warfare, and intimidation, he forced the Greek city-states into submission. By the time he was assassinated in 336 BCE, Greece was unified under Macedonian control. But unity built on fear is fragile. The moment Philip died, rebellion erupted. Athens celebrated. Thebes revolted. Persia watched closely. Many believed Macedonia would collapse without its architect. What they did not realize was that Philip had already prepared his greatest weapon. His son, Alexander, was shaped by forces far greater than ordinary kings. From childhood, he was trained not only to fight, but to think. His tutor was Aristotle, one of the greatest philosophers in history, who taught him science, medicine, logic, geography, and the stories of ancient heroes. Alexander became obsessed with Achilles, carrying a copy of Homer's Iliad wherever he went. He did not see himself as a ruler of men alone, but as a hero destined to live forever in legend. Equally powerful was the influence of his mother, Olympias, who filled Alexander's mind with the belief that he was descended from the gods themselves. She convinced him that greatness was his destiny and that fear was for lesser men. By the age of 16, Alexander was already commanding troops. At 18, he proved his brilliance at the Battle of Chaeronea, where he personally led a cavalry charge that crushed Greek resistance. These early victories forged a leader who believed nothing was impossible, and history would soon prove him right. When Alexander became king in 336 BCE, rebellion spread instantly. Greek city-states believed the young ruler would fail. Thebes openly revolted, confident that Alexander lacked the strength to respond. They were wrong. Alexander marched south with terrifying speed, surrounding the city before it could prepare defenses. The punishment was absolute. Thebes was destroyed, its population enslaved, its buildings burned to the ground. This act shocked the Greek world into silence. Athens surrendered without resistance. Greece was unified, not by loyalty, but by fear. Alexander understood a brutal truth: before conquering the world, he had to ensure no one stabbed him in the back. With Greece secured, he turned his attention eastward, toward the Persian Empire, the largest and richest empire the world had ever known. Alexander's success was not built on numbers alone. His army was smaller than Persia's, but vastly superior in discipline and leadership. The Macedonian phalanx, armed with long sarissa spears, formed an unbreakable wall of death. Behind them moved elite cavalry, archers, and engineers, all coordinated with precision. Unlike Persian kings who commanded from safety, Alexander fought on the front lines. His soldiers watched him bleed, charge, and risk death beside them. This created an unbreakable bond of loyalty. Alexander rewarded bravery, promoted talent, and punished cowardice harshly. His army did not fight for gold alone, they fought for him. This personal leadership would become one of his greatest weapons. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor, symbolically retracing the path of ancient heroes. His first major test came at the Battle of the Granicus River, where Persian governors gathered to crush him early. The river crossing was dangerous, the enemy well positioned, and defeat could have ended the campaign instantly. Against all advice, Alexander charged. He led the attack personally, nearly being killed in combat. But his boldness broke the Persian line. The victory opened Asia Minor to Macedonian control and sent a powerful message across the empire: the Persians could be defeated. Alexander was no longer an invading prince, he was a serious threat to Persian rule. In 333 BCE, Alexander faced Darius III, the great king of Persia, at the Battle of Issus. Darius commanded a massive army and believed sheer numbers would crush the Macedonians. But Alexander chose the battlefield carefully, using narrow terrain to neutralize Persian advantage. At the height of battle, Alexander charged directly toward Darius. Panic spread. The Persian king fled, abandoning his army, and even his family. This single moment shattered Persian morale. The myth of Persian invincibility died at Issus. From that day forward, Alexander was no longer fighting an empire, he was chasing a fleeing king. The island city of Tyre refused to surrender, believing the sea made it untouchable. Alexander responded with one of the most ambitious engineering projects of the ancient world. He ordered the construction of a massive causeway, slowly turning the sea into land. For 7 months, the siege dragged on. Tyre resisted fiercely. But Alexander refused to retreat. When the city finally fell, the punishment was severe. The message was clear: resistance meant destruction. Tyre proved that Alexander would not accept limits, not from nature, not from walls, not from the sea itself. In Egypt, Alexander was welcomed as a liberator. Persian rule had been harsh, and Alexander showed respect for Egyptian religion and traditions. He founded Alexandria, a city that would later become one of the greatest centers of learning in history. During his visit to the oracle of Ammonius, priests declared him the son of a god. Alexander embraced this belief. It strengthened his authority and deepened his conviction that his destiny was divine. He was no longer just conquering land, he was fulfilling a cosmic mission. In 331 BCE, Alexander faced Darius one final time at Gaugamela. The Persians prepared a massive battlefield with chariots, elephants, and overwhelming numbers. Yet Alexander remained calm. He studied the terrain, adjusted his formations, and waited for the perfect moment. When the battle began, Alexander created a gap in the Persian line and struck straight at the center. Once again, Darius fled. With that, the Persian Empire collapsed. Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis fell one by one. Centuries of Persian dominance ended, not by chance, but by strategy and leadership. With the Persian Empire defeated, Alexander faced a challenge greater than conquest: how to rule what he had taken. Instead of destroying Persian culture, he chose to absorb it. He wore Persian royal clothing, adopted court rituals, and kept much of the existing administration intact. To Alexander, ruling meant unity, not domination. He envisioned a single empire where Greeks and Persians lived as one people under one king. This decision angered many of his Macedonian soldiers. They believed Alexander was betraying his homeland and abandoning Greek superiority. Tensions grew as Alexander encouraged intermarriage and promoted Persians into high military positions. But Alexander remained firm. He did not want to be king of Macedonia alone, he wanted to be ruler of the world. His vision of cultural fusion would later define the Hellenistic age, reshaping civilization long after his death. Even after conquering Persia, Alexander was not satisfied. Driven by the belief that the world had no end, he pushed eastward into India. There, he faced unfamiliar terrain, brutal monsoon rains, and fierce resistance. At the Battle of the Hydaspes River, Alexander fought King Porus, whose army included terrifying war elephants. Though Alexander won, the cost was heavy. By now, his army had marched for nearly 8 years without rest. Soldiers were exhausted, wounded, and longing for home. When Alexander demanded they march farther east toward lands no Greek had ever seen, his men finally refused. For the first time in his life, Alexander was forced to accept limits, not from an enemy, but from his own army. The conquest of the known world had reached its edge. In 323 BCE, Alexander returned to Babylon, planning new campaigns that would push even farther west and south. But fate intervened. At just 32 years old, Alexander fell violently ill. Some believed it was disease, others whispered of poison. The truth remains a mystery. After days of suffering, the greatest conqueror in history was gone. He left behind no clear heir, only an empire held together by his personal authority. When asked who should rule, Alexander reportedly said, "To the strongest." With his death, unity collapsed. His generals turned on one another, carving the empire into pieces. What Alexander built in 13 years could not survive without him. Though his empire shattered, Alexander's legacy endured. Greek language, culture, and ideas spread across Asia, the Middle East, and Egypt, creating the Hellenistic world. Cities founded by Alexander became centers of learning, science, and trade. Alexandria's library would one day symbolize human knowledge itself. Roman generals studied Alexander's campaigns. Caesar wept at his statue. Napoleon admired his strategies. Alexander proved that leadership, vision, and belief could change the course of history. He didn't just conquer land, he connected civilizations and transformed how the world understood power. Alexander the Great conquered the known world not because he had the largest army, but because he dared to imagine a world without limits. His brilliance lay in speed, strategy, personal leadership, and an unshakable belief in destiny. In just 13 years, he achieved what empires failed to do in centuries. His story is not only about conquest, it is about ambition, risk, and the price of greatness. Alexander showed humanity what one individual could achieve, and warned what happens when an empire depends on a single man. Even today, more than 2,000 years later, his shadow still stretches across history. The world he shaped never truly disappeared, it evolved.